Thank you so much for participating in the International Conference on Forest Education, and specifically for joining us today at the session on improving the content of traditional and indigenous knowledge in forest education and strengthening traditional knowledge systems. This session is organized by the Social Forestry team at ITTO headquarters in Rome. I will start with some house rules. As you have just heard, the session is being recorded. I would also kindly ask you to please remember to keep your microphones muted during the session and only unmute when you are given the floor or you are invited to speak. And to request the floor, please use the raise hand function in the participants menu. I will say a few words about myself in the beginning. I'm a forestry officer and the focal point for indigenous and local communities in the forestry division at FAO. My work supports the promotion and implementation of indigenous people's rights across the division and our projects and programs. I also work with advocacy for integrating traditional knowledge and practices in sustainable management of forests and wildlife. Our work in FAO's forestry division is guided by the FAO policy on indigenous and tribal peoples. The division has been working with indigenous peoples for many years to address the unique challenges they face while assisting governments with the development of appropriate forestry policies that take indigenous peoples' land rights and views into account. Some of our work areas include valuing indigenous knowledge of forests and food systems, supporting collective tenure rights, supporting the role of indigenous peoples in climate change mitigation, facilitating sustainable forest management, and promoting indigenous people's rights to manage and conserve wildlife. Some examples of our work with indigenous peoples are included in a brochure, to which I hope you will be able to see the link soon in the chat box. I guess we were supposed to be having a slide on it right now, but maybe something went wrong. In any case, I would like to now introduce to you the rest of the team behind this event from the Social Forestry team, and that is Emma Gibbs, who is our facilitator, and Gordon Manu, who is our sessions rapporteur. Emma, the floor is yours.
Hi there, everyone. Hi there, Martha. My name is Emma Gibbs. I'm working with the FAO Global Forest Education Project. I'm just wondering if you can see my screen. I'm having a lot of technical difficulties this morning. So can you see the PowerPoint screen? And when I share it here, can you see this?
Yeah, we can see the entire PowerPoint. So but
okay.
Yeah.
So bear with me 1 second. For some reason, the screen doesn't want to work with me today, but while I get this fixed, so yes, my name is Emma Gibbs, working with the Global Forest Education Project here at FAO, and we're very excited to have you all today for the second session. I won't have my video screening today because my computer is lagging quite badly, but it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thanks so much.
Gordon?
Hello, thank you, Martha. My name is Gordon Manu from Ghana, and I'm working with the Social Forestry team in FAO headquarters. And today I'll be supporting this meeting by serving as a rapporteur and collect our ideas together. So thank you, happy to meet you.
Thanks a lot. So now you can see the screen, Emma. Great. Perfect. So it was the slide I was mentioning about the FAO forestry, and I will move on now to present the session of today, a little introduction to the session. So the conference builds on a more than a year-long effort by the Global Forest Education Project to collect, synthesize, and verify the status of forest education. A global forest education survey has been carried out in 6 regions and resulted in findings that forest education, training, and knowledge lacked a clear understanding of the social cultural dimensions of forests, representation and inclusion of indigenous peoples and local communities, and consequently brought into attention an evident erosion of traditional and indigenous forest-related knowledge. So the global survey has further identified 3 key pillars as essential to provide a comprehensive package for forest education and to serve as a foundation to sustainable forest management. And these are formal forest education, non-formal forest education and training, and third, integration of traditional and indigenous forest-related knowledge systems. And even though traditional knowledge is beginning to gain prominence in education spaces, there is still a lack of understanding of it, and sometimes even opposition to it. And traditional knowledge and practices in mainstream education, scientific and professional spheres. So this breakout session today is following on these findings from the survey, and we'll aim to center the critical role of traditional, local, and indigenous knowledge in forest and environmental management at local and global scales. We will also seek to determine pathways for capturing and promoting synergies between traditional and scientific knowledge. And also today we will discuss how this knowledge system can be used respectfully. So we will talk a bit about intellectual property rights. But before we move on to today's sessions, I would like to give a very quick overview of the first session on traditional knowledge, which took place yesterday. Some of you I know were at that session. We had a really great speakers from IUFRO, UNESCO, UBC, and C4, sharing their views on what traditional knowledge is in the introduction given by John Parota. Then Janet Bulkan talks about the traditional knowledge value and application at local and global scales. Joseph highlighted the importance of indigenous languages and the intergenerational transmission of indigenous knowledge. And Tonya and Natalie shared their experiences on the benefits and opportunities stemming from the indigenous-led projects. The session was recorded and will eventually be uploaded on the conference website. And today we will continue with another wonderful panel of traditional knowledge experts from other regions of the world. And the panel will hopefully be followed by an open discussion if we manage our time well. I will give more detailed introduction to our speakers in a moment when we move to the panel. But first, we are not so many, but we will try to see who is in our Zoom room. By following one quick interactive exercise. I will give the floor to Emma, perhaps, to facilitate that.
Great, thanks ever so much, Martha. So I'm going to try to put something on the screen now, and in the meantime, I'm going to drop a link just in the chat box. And essentially what we would like for you to do is just to describe who you are in maybe one word or two words. And I'm just going to grab this up for you now, so bear with me 1 minute. Okay, so I'm just trying to drop something in the chat box now. Can everyone see this link? It's the Menti link. Do you let me know if you can see it? Sorry, for some reason my screen is being really unpredictable today. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to share my screen and hope this will work. And so this is really just to capture who's in the room. This could be sort of maybe what you do or sort of who you represent. And I'm just going to give you an example now. Just going to share the screen. Do let me know when you can see this. So we've got examples here, ethnobotanist, social forester, indigenous knowledge expert, trainer. I can't see that one at the very side. Maybe that's because it's my screen. So can you see this now? Shivani, excellent. So this is really just to capture sort of who we are in the room. I know that there's sort of about 19 of us today, but it's good to sort of get an idea who's in the room, and we'll keep this up for sort of maybe another minute, and then we can proceed with the speakers. So this is great. Thank you so much. Thanks for populating this. Excellent. So we've had some more additions here, intern, policy advisor, environmental scientist, which is really great. Forest trainer as well, which I may not have seen before, but this is really great. It's really good to get a sense of the room. So I will stop sharing now and pass the floor back to Marta. This is great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you, everyone who participated. I think it's always great to see the diversity of people and backgrounds we have in the room, and hopefully we will have some time for discussion where we could use our unique skills to discuss our topic of today. So I will move now to the panel of today. All the speakers will have 8 minutes to present the interventions and provide recommendations for the session and also for the wider conference and Global Forest Education Project. Emma will let you know when you have 1 minute left of your presentation, and we will be strict today, as yesterday we were a little bit late. So please try not to go over time, because we would like to have this open discussion at the end. A small note to the audience: if you have any questions to the panelists, please just submit them in the chat box and we will revert to them after the panel session. So our first speaker today is Ms. Marino Ngotto. She's a program officer for training and learning initiatives at the Center for People and Forest in Recoft. She joined Recoft in 2019, bringing 10 years experience promoting rights and providing training for indigenous peoples and local communities in the Asia-Pacific region. Before joining Recoft, Marie worked with different non-governmental organizations, and one specifically focusing on establishing School of Indigenous Knowledge and Traditions. Marie is a member of the Kankani Indigenous Peoples of the Philippines. She is a proponent of traditional and indigenous knowledge, which is a reflection of her identity as an indigenous woman and her education and work experiences. Marie has master's degrees in social and development studies and in lifelong learning. Today, Marie has kindly agreed to give a talk entitled "The Whole Village is a School." It is truly an honor to have you here, Marie. The floor is yours for the next 8 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening. Can I clarify if I'm going to be the one sharing my screen, or it will be the...
Yes, if that's possible, Marie, that would be great.
Marie,
thanks so much.
Please try, and if in case it's not possible, we will share your presentation.
Okay. So you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So as Marta has introduced me, I am Marie, and I work as a training and learning officer in Recoft. No? So my organization is actually called Recoft, and the Center for People and Forests is a tagline, no? But please refer to my organization as Recoft. Okay, so now I'm going to be talking about the whole village is a school. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I am a member of the Kankana'i-Igorot indigenous peoples from the Philippines. Kankana'i is also the name of my mother tongue. So what you see in the screen is a picture of my hometown, Sabangan, the place where I grew up. The topic of this session, of this breakout session, is very close to my heart. I believe it is timely to discuss how we can use traditional and indigenous knowledge in formal and non-formal education. I say so because traditional and indigenous knowledge is often treated as an informal or extracurricular activity that happens outside of the school. What I hope to show you in my presentation is how we can bring traditional knowledge into the classroom, and in equal manner, how we can broaden the classroom to include the whole village. And doing so will benefit both education system and the community. Okay, but first, a little bit of introduction about Recoft, my workplace. At Recoft, We believe in a future where people live equitably and sustainably in and beside healthy, resilient forests. We take a long-term, landscape-based and inclusive approach to supporting local communities to secure their land and resource rights, stop deforestation, find alternative livelihoods, and foster gender equity. And many of the communities that we work with use customary practices to manage forests and preserve its resources. And we have learned that including traditional and indigenous knowledge in formal and non-formal forest education presents a lot of opportunities. It makes forest education more relevant. It enriches the curriculum with pertinent and sustainable forest practices. And it links the education directly to the community and the natural environment that surrounds it and upon which it depends. Okay, so today I will tell you how we integrate traditional and indigenous knowledge in forest education systems at RECOF through the example of Quan Kreng, the largest peat swamp forest in Thailand. GEF, UNDP, the Thailand government, and RECOF work with the communities of Quan Kreng to conserve and restore their precious landscape. And as an educator, the most exciting part of this project to me is the integrated peat swamp curriculum. Okay, so this is the integrated peat swamp curriculum. We have developed it through a participatory process that engaged teachers from the formal education system and traditional knowledge holders who are familiar and who are experts of the different ways to use and sustainably manage the peat swamp forest. The Office of Basic Education Commission of Thailand reviewed and endorsed this curriculum for use for students from grade 1 to grade 9 in the formal education system. And you can see here that there are 6 lessons in the curriculum, and they start with the geographical and socio-cultural context of the learners' community, which is the peat swamp forest. All 6 lessons are developed in accordance with the educational standards and indicators of Thailand's 2008 Basic Education Core Curriculum. The curriculum includes field activities so that the students can test the knowledge they gained in the classroom in real-life situation in their natural environment. In lesson 5, for example, which is on the use of swamp resources, children visit the area of the forest where krajud is harvested. You can see in the picture, no, the krajud. So it's the green thing, and it is called the emerald of the peat swamp. You know, it grows abundantly in the peat swamp forest, and then the community members weave it into mats, into baskets. So the school children, after viewing the part of the forest where they harvest the krajud, they now go to the krajud basketry station and learn about artisanal weaving. So these field activities are done together with traditional knowledge holders. So there are regular activities where students and other young people from the community learn how to weave from the Krajud enterprise members. You can see in the photo the members of this enterprise. Some young people work part-time with the community weaving enterprise on marketing on social media. So this strengthens intergenerational relationship within the community. The youth learn from the elders, and it ensures traditional and indigenous knowledge are preserved. And this is just one of the many benefits of integrating traditional knowledge in the formal education curriculum. No? Aside from intergenerational knowledge, the integration also makes traditional knowledge visible, and this leads to its revival and strengthening. With this integration, learning becomes more relevant to the learners. They see their history, their way of life, and natural resources reflected in the things that they are learning. So let's now go to the, these are the recommendations, no? Given our experience in the integrated PITSWAM curriculum, these are the next steps. So first is the presence of a supportive policy is important. This was made possible because Thailand has the Basic Education Core Curriculum 2008 policy that promotes the development of local curriculum. This is in response to decentralization and the need to tackle deterioration of natural resources and local wisdom. So second is the importance of participatory processes. You know, it cannot be overemphasized. The process should include schools, local community members, especially traditional knowledge holders, local government, and related local organizations. So these stakeholders participated in the planning, testing, implementation, reflection of the integrated PITSWAM forest curriculum. And last but not the least is that there should be opportunities for dialogue. The Kwankreng project created an opportunity for the local community and the formal education system to work together, and both were enriched by the process. However, dialogue depends on trust and respect that local communities have something to contribute. So I will end my presentation on the last note. I believe that local communities and indigenous peoples and the formal education system can benefit from each other. If we open the space for collaboration and take an integrated approach, we can create more inclusive learning experiences for the next generation, and at the same time protecting our forests. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie, for the beautiful example of developing the local curriculum through a participatory process of various knowledge holders. And yeah, it is true that with formal education, very often, for example, children spend much time learning completely passively in the classroom meetings, rather than engage in hands-on learning on the land. So the approach presented by you, on the other hand, seems not only to uphold the knowledge itself, but also local tradition and actual skills, and create interest among youth in their cultural heritage. Thank you so much. Our next speaker today is Dr. Siddhappa Shetty, who is an associate professor and the convener of the Center for Environment and Development in the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, short ATRE. He is based in Bangalore, India. Siddhappa is an ethnobotanist. He holds a PhD from the University of Mysore, India. He is a committed researcher practitioner who has bridged science, policy, and practice to achieve sustainable development in the tribal areas of Western Ghats. Over a 27-year career, he has made tremendous contributions to sustainable use of forest resources and creation of livelihood opportunities for around 30,000 tribal people by supporting tenure, forest-based enterprises, and forest restoration. He also does philanthropic work with his friends and provides scholarships to economically challenged students. Today, Siddhappa will talk about ways of bridging traditional and scientific knowledge with regards to biodiversity conservation in India. Siddhappa, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Martha, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you very much for everybody listening to me, and Martha for cooperation and inviting me for this conference. You can hear me, right? I can share my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Martha, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And everybody, you know, the fascinating work done by everybody, you know, so exciting. Thank you very much for sharing. And I'm going to talk about the rich traditional knowledge, the strength of this traditional knowledge, how it's relevant to the scientific knowledge. That's what I'm going to talk about that. And based on that, there are some interventions being done using traditional knowledge. So you'll get to hear from me about that. I'm coming from ITTO. ITTO stands for Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, the institute based out of Bangalore. This is the research site I'm speaking about. It's a Western Ghats, one of the biodiversity hotspot in the world, as 60 tigers and 12,000 tribal population in this landscape, indigenous community. This landscape is also popularly known as the land where tiger and people coexist. That's exciting, isn't it? This tribal community is one of the oldest tribal community in the landscape. They lived from millennia in this landscape. They used to do shifting, cultivation, and hunting, and now they depend on forest resources for their livelihood. And what we started was, we started working very closely with the community to trying to understand their traditional knowledge, their drivers of change to the biodiversity. What are the burning issues in these landscapes? That's what we are trying to discuss with them. 25 years back, the participatory process were followed. According to them, the forest fire is a big issue because the forest used to get burned every year, and now it's been controlled. It's causing canopy fire. That's causing a lot of damage to the forest fire. That's a concern based on their traditional knowledge. So secondly, because of the large canopy fire and everything, forest get cleared, and the invasive species is coming and invading in the forest. The lantana camera, you might be knowing, is from South America, is invading our forest. I will come to that later. And also there are some parasites also causing quite a bit of damage to the trees being used by the community for their livelihood. And based on their traditional knowledge, they said that the lantana is a major issue. We are trying to find out, validate this, and trying to understand their traditional knowledge. What we did was, 20 years back, we did a survey. I did a survey and then identified the 4% of the land and understood that 20 years back, the lantana population was 4%. And 10 years back, it was 34%. Now it is 49%. From 96% to 66, and now 53%. You can imagine the 50% of the biodiversity has gone in this landscape because of the invasive species like lantana. And then we are trying to find out what happens to the, when you start removing the lantana in this landscape. That when you're removing lantana, that contributed enhancing the biodiversity. The seedling sapling population is increasing, and the percentage of grass cover is increasing, and the animals started coming back. That is what we find out. Now, how do you remove this lantana? That was the question we had. The people used to use bamboo for their livelihood to make furnitures, baskets, and things like that. We thought, why can't people start using lantana, invasive species, instead of bamboo? Because bamboo is being used by a lot of wild animals, especially ungulates, including elephants. So we started encouraging people to use lantana to make baskets 15 years back, and they're trying to modify it to attract to develop marketing strategy, and they started making different furnitures. And then now they are at the stage of making a life-size elephants out of lantana. It's interesting, isn't it? So these are the products coming out of lantana in this landscape. That 1,000 people are trained, and 12 million rupees being earned by these people. And lantana density started reducing the forest. And this project received a social impact award from Germany 2020, just last year. And that was one of the stories used traditional knowledge to enhance biodiversity and at the same time increase the livelihood of the community. This one is NTFP related. The sustainable people are also depending on forest resources for their livelihood. So the 60 to 70% of income was coming from that. So to try to address the sustainable related issues, people, enterprise-based conservation model was followed. And to increase their income, and the income is being increased from this processing unit, will go back to the community in the form of an incentive to conserve the forest. At the same time, the resource being harvested sustainably in this landscape. And this is one of the traditional knowledge I was validating. And I encouraged people to estimate the productivity using their traditional knowledge. And I was also followed scientific way of estimating the productivity. It was amazing, the estimation done by the community in this landscape and the estimation done by scientists, they were amazingly comparable. So you can imagine the wealth of the traditional, the richness of the traditional knowledge people have in this landscape. These are the maps produced by the community. So, I was thinking, we have a handful of scientists across India, all over the world. And why can't we use the traditional knowledge to estimate productivity and monitor these resources? That was my question, actually. And another thing we understood was like a forest, people need a tenure. Without tenure, they'll not be able to achieve more. And the tenure was important. We worked on Forest Right Act. Under the Forest Right Act, we were able to get community rights and individual rights for the community. The community rights includes the use of forest resources sustainably. At the same time, they can use it for their livelihood. And these are the rights people have received. Around 20,000 people got benefited from this activity. The one more interesting work we did was, and this invitation came from the community themselves. They requested us to map traditional sacred sites for them. And this was the 540 square kilometer of the forest. We started involving community in mapping this sacred sites. We found 480 sacred sites in 540 square kilometers. So many trees are being worshipped. There's so many stones. Each and every animal is being worshipped by the community. This is the picture. What you see is, the person is worshipping tiger stone. It's quite famous. It's amazing, actually. 540 square kilometer of the forest, 480 sacred sites we found. The another important thing what we did was we have scientists classify forest types, right? We used community to classify the forest using their traditional knowledge. And based on their traditional knowledge, they identified 6 different forest types and 20 subclasses of forest types. This is the map produced by the community. They're using their traditional knowledge. It is not a scientific, the map. What you see is based on the traditional knowledge. So that was one of the things. And lastly, what we did was the traditional knowledge, the rich traditional knowledge was fading, and the younger generation is missing this knowledge. We thought that the agriculture related traditional knowledge and forest sustainable use related traditional knowledge and so much traditional knowledge, and being right, we kind of collected this information and then wrote a book on this. And this book has received the best book award, actually. It has a description of 175 activities and flashcards, game cards, and everything. It's the program for students from 1st standard to 10th standard received a best book award. And this is my recommendations. The community would have a tenure, tenure and the strong institutional structure is important. Without tenure, it's difficult. People will lose the resource. The external agency will come and exploit everything. When people have tenure, they'll have ownership on the resource. That's one thing. And the second one is participatory resource monitoring technique were highly effective. And I was very impressed. And people should use this. And across India, across the world, people should be encouraged to use their participatory resource monitoring technique to monitor the resources they have. That's the second one. And the third one is sustained participatory monitoring would require incentive. People should get an incentive to conserve the biodiversity, and it will be helpful for them and also helpful for the biodiversity. And it's can bring a win-win situation. That's the third recommendation. And the fourth one is the people used to use fire. They call this a litter fire, lean fire every year. The control of the forest fire, because in the name of protected area, and it's contributing to the increase of biomass in the landscape. It's leading to the canopy fire and creating a lot of other problems like invasive species. And this need to be tested, and people should be encouraged to use, controlled fire instead of completely banning the fire. These are the recommendations from our research. And thank you very much for FAO and all the participants to listening to me. And let's keep in touch and collaborate if possible. And after pandemic, people would like to visit our site, you're welcome to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sidapa, for this very interesting and comprehensive presentation and showing how traditional knowledge can be used to actually enhance biodiversity. And at the same time, for raising awareness on the challenges that the local communities face, for example, in terms of tenure, which is a key. It was also great to see an example of an educational tool, such as the book that you presented that contains traditional practices. Thank you so much. Our next speaker today is Dr. Margaret Straku-Larte. Margaret is a chartered librarian with over 30 years experience in information management. She holds a PhD in geography and rural development with specializations in indigenous knowledge and climate change adaptation. Margaret has a passion for local and indigenous peoples, and as a professional librarian, her concern has always been with the lack of clear guidelines on the respectful and consensual management of indigenous knowledge. She believes that for this to happen, a convergence needs to be reached between academia, librarians, publishers, researchers, and policymakers. Today, Dr. Margaret will talk about the need to bring forestry education closer home by integrating indigenous knowledge system using digitization. Very much looking forward to your talk, dear Margaret. The floor is yours for the next 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Martha. I want to share my slides. Okay, can you see my
screen? Yes.
You can see my slides?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay. All right. I want to talk about, good morning, everybody. It's about 7 o'clock a.m. here in Ghana. I bring you greetings from Ghana and IUFRO. That is where I work. It's an institution for forestry research. And I want to talk about bringing forestry education closer home. And we want to see if we can integrate indigenous knowledge systems into the education system using digitization. The picture below is the aerial picture of my institution, IUFRO. It is a great honor for me to be giving this paper this morning. I think yesterday the stage was set for us to understand what indigenous knowledge is all about. Indigenous knowledge is defined as the local knowledge that is unique to a given culture or society, which means that within a particular society, it's knowledge that has accumulated over the years. It covers all fields of human endeavor, including, but not necessarily limited to agriculture, forestry and the environment, health, political systems, trade and economics. But the depth and the extent and depth of knowledge mankind can gain from indigenous knowledge goes to show that we ought to be paying a lot more attention to indigenous knowledge through policy intervention than we are currently doing. And if we look at policy application for the use of indigenous knowledge, we realize that indigenous knowledge forms the basis for decisions pertaining to food security, animal health, education, natural resource management, and other vital activities. And we realize that if any nation is to develop, we should start at the local level. And those decisions that are taken at the local level should filter through to the very top. So governments must realize that indigenous knowledge is an essential resource for the developmental process. Its application plays an essential role in the lifestyle of members of the local community. So, since it accumulates over many years and generations, it has to be documented. But what we realize is that when holders of this knowledge pass away, the knowledge dies with them. And then you go into the academic field, you realize that indigenous knowledge is often shunned by institutions of higher learning, which prefer the usual Anglo-American centered knowledge systems. And they often describe indigenous knowledge as primitive, rural, and non-scientific. There appears, therefore, to be a disconnect between knowledge and knowledge acquired through formal education and its application at the local level. So the irony is that The major educational programs in our tertiary institutions revolve around the key disciplines covered by indigenous knowledge. So you have people taking courses in forestry, agriculture, pharmacy, and so many others. And many of the indigenous knowledge systems revolve around these same topics, but there has not necessarily been a convergence between what is taught in the classroom and what the local people know. Indigenous knowledge must thus be made the foundation upon which to develop and build our knowledge systems in higher education. So what exists between the Western form of knowledge and indigenous knowledge is just a difference in approach. And if we are able to get it right, each one can maintain its own distinct identity, but can converge at a certain point. So the two knowledge systems must be able to converge. Now, forestry education at all levels, especially at the tertiary level, must be relevant to the needs of the people. It's not enough to gain knowledge that cannot be applied, or knowledge no one understands. Our tertiary education system must factor in knowledge points derived from local people, including how they manage and use their natural resources. So I'm going to give you an example of a practical study we did on indigenous knowledge. We did a study in 3 administrative districts in Ghana on indigenous forest foods and medicinal plants. And we identified 83 forest plant foods and 199 medicinal plants. And there were 2 plants that I want to talk about. The turkey berry is Solanum torvum, which is used to make sauces. It's good for anemic, but it's also good for anemic patients when blended and ground. But in the survey, all we knew about was the fact that turkey berry is good for sauces, it's good for food. But it's when we went to the local community that we realized that it was good for anemic patients, those who needed blood and other things, when it's drank on its own, not as a sauce. And then there's another plant, water leaf. It's also another delicious forest food consumed in soups and stews. And it also has valuable medicinal properties. It is reported to be good in reducing high cholesterol level and reducing tremors in Parkinson's patients. But we didn't know this. We didn't know anything about the fact that it could reduce tremors in Parkinson's patients. It's only when we went to the local people that they will talk. They'll mention that when you are shaking, then it will reduce it. So it's something that we need to really pay attention to at the local level. Many of the forest foods have high nutritional value, and they could actually contribute to improved diets to help achieve food security. We could also tap on the knowledge of the local people to develop a clear database on what foods or what medicinal plants are available, and then get our researchers to begin work on some of these plants so that we can tap them to the fullest level. We identified those valuable medicinal species. We validated them in the lab. We brought them to the lab. We found out the local, the scientific names, the local names, and then we documented them and store them using this digitization. But remember that we studied over 199 different species, medicinal species, in only 3 locations. So imagine the volume of data that can be garnered if we study the whole country, not to mention a global database. If we were to go out globally and get everybody to document all the knowledge that they have, imagine what the world will be reaping from, the kind of knowledge we'll be acquiring. So digitization is just an option for the preservation of indigenous knowledge on forest resources. And this must be linked to forestry education, either to make the information easily accessible or to get students to contribute to this rich body of knowledge on a global scale. Indigenous knowledge must thus be protected intellectually so that the local people can benefit from its use. What usually happens is that when a value is found for a particular indigenous species, then the business people will move in and begin to exploit it, all to the detriment of the local people. And most of the time, they don't even benefit from this kind of knowledge. So this can be done only if we are able to identify, if we're able to collect the data, if we're able to document and then store this knowledge for the use by all. In another study we did,
Margaret, sorry to interrupt. We're at 8 minutes now, so if it's possible to sum up, that'd be great. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. So we did a study on climate change, and we realized that the 3 global needs that indigenous knowledge can relate to are food security, healthcare, and climate change. And we'll be doing ourselves a huge disservice if we allow all this rich body of knowledge on the above to go extinct. We need to act now to avoid losing all these treasure troves of knowledge. So my recommendations are that we should begin to incorporate indigenous knowledge into forestry education. There must be a global drive to preserve indigenous knowledge, and digitization can be an option for storing and preserving this. So let's remember there's an old African proverb that says that if an old man dies, the whole library bears to the ground. It's very necessary to preserve our knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for giving all your recommendations and also for giving us examples of how valuable and unique traditional knowledge is and the need for it to be documented. And I think the discussion we need to have is definitely about the documenting traditional knowledge and at the same time making sure that we are respecting the intellectual property rights. And there is this kind of conflicting demand here. In a way, on one way we want to protect it, on the other way we need to make sure that it's being shared. So we will have a speaker later on from IUFRO, who I'm sure will also address this topic. But I think, as you mentioned, Margaret, that the traditional knowledge library or depository is a possible solution to making sure that this knowledge sharing is actually made in a transparent way. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Mr. Sparkler Brefo-Samar, who is a human geographer currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Calgary, Canada. Sparkler also works with the Forestry Research Institute of Ghana as a researcher. He has over 8 years of experience working with indigenous forest fringe communities in Ghana. Over the years, he has participated in several research projects, including an ITTO project on conservation and utilization of medicinal plants in Ghana. Today, Sparkler will provide insights on some missing links in formal forestry education and urge for a more integrated and holistic approach to education. Sparkler, great to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen now. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you could see it now.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you insights on what I find are some of the missing links in formal forest education. And the objective of this presentation is to provide insights from my learning experiences during a study aimed at documenting indigenous knowledge on forest foods and medicinal plants in Ghana. And I must say, I did this work with Dr. Shakolate, who just made a presentation. Yeah. Okay. Now, the presentation will further provide suggestions towards an integrated holistic approach to forest education. The insight I'll be sharing comes from an interview with about 606 indigenous knowledge experts from 9 different communities, which are distributed across 3 political administrative districts in Ghana. And aside this, we also did validation made up of about 30 indigenous knowledge experts, and they were drawn from each of the 3 administrative districts. Now, indigenous knowledge is a social capital of the poor and can contribute to conservation and development. Now, however, indigenous knowledge is dwindling and is at risk of even full disappearance. Now, local people are the originators and custodians of indigenous knowledge. And indigenous knowledge is rooted in specific places and centers around a set of experiences. However, indigenous knowledge experts are not given adequate opportunity to participate in developing curricula for formal forest education. Now, this is one insight which I wish to share with you, that there's so much ought to be done. So the first insight would be to actively involve indigenous knowledge experts in the development of curriculum within the formal forest education. Now, promoting a holistic forest education that identifies indigenous knowledge as an integral part of forest education must address the enormous power asymmetry between scientists, academics, and indigenous knowledge experts. Now, this is because even though there has been tremendous improvement on how scientists and academics regard indigenous knowledge systems, there is still much left undone. Now, the case study which I am presenting insights from indicated, for instance, that practitioners of traditional medicine, which we call herbal practitioners, were generally considered primitive by orthodox healthcare practitioners. And this kind of created serious issue when it comes to trust and also being able to provide all the information which they were custodians of. Now, these asymmetric relations create challenges, particularly the willingness of indigenous knowledge experts to engage in participatory process fully. Now, this creates mistrust and hinders forging a mutual beneficial relationship. Now, this affects the depth of information experts, that is indigenous knowledge experts, are even willing to share. Now, in the case of what we did in Ghana, we realized that during the study, the quality of information shared by indigenous knowledge experts drastically improved over time with trust. Now, this is an indication that when there is collaboration or full partnership, it would lead to an increase in knowledge sharing and also making sure that those who are custodians of knowledge really give the right information. For instance, even though different species of plants are used in combination for curing various diseases, I realized that participants were not willing to give the combinations, but rather were willing to only give just the species that they use. But it's not just one species which they use in curing disease. Usually they come in combination. But it was after they had developed trust that they were willing to even tell us the combinations which work in curing various ailments. Now, fully integrating indigenous knowledge experts into formal forest education will help bridge this massive gap by generating the needed trust, as I am talking about. Yeah, the other insight which I wish to also share is that students lack adequate engagement with indigenous knowledge experts. And as I indicated earlier, indigenous knowledge is part of the local people's everyday lives and are rooted in specific places. But there's this lack of general engagement of students with those who are custodians of knowledge. So I believe that students' engagement with indigenous knowledge experts would provide an opportunity to obtain first-hand information, which are generally lacking in formal classroom environments. Yeah. Finally, there also exist gender differences in indigenous knowledge on forest foods and medicinal plants, and this must also inform the kind of experts that we engage in imparting IK knowledge. Yeah. The study revealed that women are generally more knowledgeable than men. However, when it comes to Ghana and other African countries in particular, there is this gender disadvantages in a particular society, particularly among indigenous societies. Now, male household heads usually tend to self-nominate for conversations on indigenous knowledge. However, it might not necessarily be the male who are really knowledgeable when it comes to such information. So in identifying whom to even consult during knowledge sharing, we should be able to consider these gender differences in knowledge acquisition. Now, to better tap into the knowledge of women, now efforts must be made to also circumvent the tendency of just selecting male experts to integrate them into the formal forest education. So finally, I tend to just draw some few recommendations from the insights which I just shared. So the first one is effort must be made to kind of encourage IK experts to participate in classroom teaching. Not just with that, but they also kind of be made part in the whole process. So when it comes to engagement, it shouldn't just be with educators who would rather go to these experts and then impart knowledge to students, but rather students should be made to have an engagement with the indigenous knowledge experts in person. And also, we must also try as much as possible to circumvent the tendency to select just males as indigenous knowledge experts and then to integrate them into the formal forest education. Even in situations where women are knowledgeable, there's also the tendency to just focus on males because of how our society is structured. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sparkler. Actually, you mentioned something that hasn't come up in this session so far, or at least not very strongly, which is raising awareness of gender differences when it comes to traditional knowledge, and the need to engage both indigenous women experts and men in education. And as previously mentioned by Marie, in the actual first-hand information and practice sharing, as well as development of school curricula. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ms. Fei Zhao, who is a program officer in the Traditional Knowledge Division of WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization. She supports the Secretariat of the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetics, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore to facilitate the work of the committee and provides technical assistance to various stakeholders. She received a Master of Laws on intellectual property from the University of Washington and PhD on intellectual property law, in particular intellectual property and traditional medical knowledge in Washington University in St. Louis. Today, Fei will talk about the relationship between intellectual property and traditional knowledge and WIPO's related services. Fei, it is wonderful that you could join us today. Please, the floor is yours for 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta. Thank you for FAO inviting us, to this session, and we are honored, to be part of this this panel. So I will be very brief to introduce you WIPO's work on traditional knowledge, which including the knowledge related to forest. So first, let me to briefly introduce you, what's, in the context of WIPO's work, what is traditional knowledge? So traditional knowledge is intellectual and intangible cultural heritage and the knowledge system of a traditional community, including the indigenous people and the local communities. So there are different kinds of traditional knowledge, such as the traditional agricultural knowledge, scientific know-how, technical knowledge, and the knowledge related to biodiversity. So when we talk about intellectual property, there are two kinds of protection. There is a defensive protection, which aims to stop the people from outside of the community acquiring intellectual property rights over the traditional knowledge. So, sorry, just go back to the, the previous speaker, Margaret mentioned about, digitization, which we considered as part of, defensive protection, because once you document, traditional knowledge, and then it's somehow to prevent others, to get intellectual property. The second category of protection is positive protection, which is to grant the rights which will empower the community to protect their traditional knowledge and control its use, and also get benefit from the commercialization of such knowledge. So the existing IP system, the conventional IP system, can be used to protect traditional knowledge. For example, the patent system can be used to protect the innovations based on traditional knowledge. For trademark can be used to protect the products which based on the traditional knowledge. Of course, there is also gaps, of the conventional IP system. That's why some countries has already adopted sui generis system, to protect traditional knowledge from the intellectual property perspective. So WIPO's service, WIPO has 7 service area relating to traditional knowledge. Because of the time, I'm not going to go to the details, but just highlight a few. The first, I would like to introduce, the WIPO Secretariat support the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Traditional Folklore, also called WIPO IGC. At the moment, the IGC with its mandate is to negotiate text-based negotiation with the objective of finalizing agreement on an international legal instrument or instruments to ensure the balanced and effective protection of traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and traditional cultural expressions. So I have to say that, there are many challenges regarding this process. Because there are different stakeholders during this process. So the member states, industry, who is kind of like a user of the traditional knowledge, and also the indigenous people and the local community who are the holders of such knowledge. So it's very challenging. The IGC has been negotiating this international legal instrument since 2010. And as you can see, 10 years has passed, and there was no agreement yet, regarding this international legal instrument. Another service area I want to introduce is about, WIPO training and mentoring program for indigenous women entrepreneur. And this year we will have another circle of the training. It will open to all the indigenous entrepreneur, not only limited to women. So this project, this service, we provide, hands-on training to the indigenous entrepreneur to tell them how to empower themselves with intellectual property tool in their business. And also after the training, we will also, mentoring the participants to implement their projects, to practically use IP tools to protect their traditional knowledge in their business. Another service area which linked to what the previous speaker, Margaret, presented is about the documentation, digitalization of traditional knowledge. So when document traditional knowledge, you have to consider intellectual property issues, because without intellectual property consideration, you might damage certain rights over the traditional knowledge. So WIPO have already developed different tools to support different stakeholders to protect the traditional knowledge while documenting them. So here is an example of the toolkit we developed, to support stakeholders document traditional knowledge. The lastly, I want to share with you some, training program for those who are interested. We have 2 distance learning course. One is regarding traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. As you can see here that, at the moment we are opening, for registration. So for those who are interested, you can register. And there is another trainings on genetic resources. The training program, the training course is starting now. So I mean, it's a bit late to register, but next year there will be another course which, if you are interested, you can register. So this is concluding my presentation, and there is some useful information which you can check later. So Marta also asked, whether we could make some recommendations at the end of the presentation. So there are 2 recommendations I can conclude. So the first is, it's very important, for all the stakeholders to know that intellectual property is a powerful tool, to protect, traditional knowledge. And I think, all the different stakeholders need to, bear this in mind. And the second recommendation is, we strongly encourage, the education, the awareness raising of intellectual property protection of traditional knowledge should be part of the forest educations. So maybe there is no need to have very thorough course regarding the intellectual property protection, but at least some basic awareness raising course regarding that intellectual property is needed. So thank you so much again, Marta, for inviting WIPO, to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faye. A wonderful presentation and very insightful, and really great to hear about the project empowering indigenous women entrepreneurs and learning more about intellectual property rights. And as you mentioned, they are very often seen as synonymous with commercialization, which would result, let's say, in an outsider putting some kind of value on traditional knowledge, which in that sense is kind of contrary to the humanistic application intended for traditional knowledge. So when it comes to education, I think more thinking about exploitation, we are thinking about cultural preservation, right? So these are all the things that we need to think about when we talk about the future of the forest education and including of traditional knowledge. And thank you also very much for introducing the toolkit and distance learning courses. I'm sure our participants will be very much interested in it, myself included. Thank you very much, and I hope we will continue to work together. Our last speaker today is Mr. Jon Fernandez de la Rinoa, who is an agricultural economist and the chief of the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit. He joined FAO in 1998 and has worked mainly in Latin America and Asia, coordinating various emergency operations. In 2010, Jon joined the partnerships and the UN Relations Division leading the FAO civil society team and supported the participation of civil society in the World Committee of Food Security. He co-founded the Pastoralist Knowledge Hub in FAO and started the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit in 2014. The unit implements FAO policy on indigenous peoples by working on FPIC, collective rights, and indigenous youth. Last year, in 2020, the Committee of Agriculture endorsed the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food Systems, now including 16 academic, research, UN, and indigenous organizations. In this regard, Jon will tell us about the process of co-creation of knowledge on indigenous peoples' food systems and possible interconnecting issues around forest education. Jon, thank you so much for being here. Please, the floor is yours for the next 8 minutes.
Thank you so much, Marta. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. And first, congratulations for the excellent seminar, and thank you for inviting us. I think it's very important for the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit to be here with you. Many of the indigenous peoples we work with across the world live in forest areas and depend on forest resources. So it's extremely important the efforts that you're doing. Allow me to share my screen, Marta, and I will run you briefly through a PowerPoint presentation where I will be talking about the co-creation of knowledge and why it is so important. Please allow me to share my screen.
Hi, Jon. Hi, Jon. It's Emma here. I'm just thinking I may not be able to allow you to share your screen because you weren't made co-host before the meeting. So I'm wondering if it's possible if you'd like to share your slides with me via email, and then I can just share them up instantly.
Okay, I will do it without the PowerPoint presentation then, Emma. Thank you so much.
Okay, we can share the slides with everyone after.
I'm going to be talking about the process of co-creation of knowledge on indigenous people's subsistence and biodiversity. Now, as you know, there is more than 476 million indigenous peoples in the world. This is more than 6% of the population. Some of the broken data that we have indicate that they make up almost 19% of the world's stream pool. And they live in more than 90 countries across the world in 7 sociocultural regions. They belong to more than 5,000 different cultural and groups, and they speak 4,000 out of the 6,700 languages still existing in the world. And this will be my first take-home message today: the fact that indigenous peoples are not only impressive guardians of biodiversity, but they have a tremendous cultural and traditional knowledge richness that often goes unnoticed. Under the 4 new better pillars of the FAO strategy, talking about better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life, the 7 pillars of work of the Indigenous Peoples Unit cut across. And today I will be talking about the Indigenous Peoples food systems and Indigenous Peoples knowledge and climate change, those 2 pillars that are fundamental for our work. Now, in 2009 and 2013, FAO and McGill University partnered to start work on Indigenous Peoples food systems. They released 2 flagship publications. And in 2015, when we met with a caucus of Indigenous peoples in Rome, they requested that FAO continues with a task force on Indigenous peoples food systems, understanding the centrality of Indigenous peoples food systems to preserve biodiversity and also language, culture, and cosmogony. In 2018, we organized the first high-level expert seminar on Indigenous peoples food systems at FAO of Rome. And the main outcome about this was the consensus to create a global hub on Indigenous peoples food systems. And like Marta was saying at the beginning in the introduction, this was presented to the countries at 2020, and they endorsed at the Committee of Agriculture the launching of the Global Hub on Indigenous peoples food systems. Now, what is this Global Hub on Indigenous peoples food systems? It's a platform, it's a knowledge platform that today includes 18 members, universities, research centers, indigenous organizations, and the UN, under the core principle of co-constructing knowledge and evidence base around indigenous peoples. And we are doing this together with scientists and indigenous peoples alike. It works under a principle of respect and recognition of not only the importance of innovation and technology, but very importantly, scientific and indigenous peoples' knowledge systems, very often transmitted through orality. And this is very important because we see that one of the difficulties that scientists have or that we have is understanding oral knowledge and incorporating this into written knowledge and giving it the same level of dignity and recognition. There is a bunch of universities from Massey University to Cambridge University, of course, C4, Biodiversity International, but also Monash University, Gaia Amazonas, the Sami Parliament. There is the UN Permanent Forum, Inputs, and UNESCO that are working with us under the Global Hub. Now, as you know, it's very important to complement scientific, Cartesian, and linear ways of understanding reality with indigenous ways of understanding reality, which are often holistic, spiraled, they are systemic, inclusive, and they are based very much in reciprocity and circularity. We are right now undertaking fieldwork in more than 12 different indigenous peoples' food systems across the world. And one of the main and interesting facts that many of you know is the tremendous overlapping between pockets of biodiversity, protected areas, forested areas, and indigenous peoples' territories. There are 3 essential pillars in indigenous peoples' food systems, and this has to do with the linkage between health and nutrition, natural resource and biodiversity, and language and culture. When any of these pillars suffers, indigenous peoples' food systems tend to deteriorate. In some of the work we have done in Meghalaya with the Kasi people, one of the things that we found out is that many of the foods that indigenous peoples in Kasi, in Meghalaya are eating, we don't know the scientific or English name. We only have the Kasi denomination. And there is so much to learn for all of us. I want to talk about the importance of indigenous peoples driven solutions. And we are working with indigenous peoples in Colombia, in Ecuador, but also in Thailand, to put together a new concept, which is indigenous peoples biocentric restoration. And it's putting indigenous peoples' knowledge at the center of the restoration efforts in degraded lands. This is a new approach that moves away from the current approaches that are being mainstreamed by conservation organizations, restoration organizations, and ministries of environment. It's placing indigenous peoples' knowledge at the center. Some of the things that the Global Hub has been doing is the writing of the White Wipala paper, integrating comments from more than 60 experts and 39 organizations. This Wipala paper has been presented to the scientific group that is informing the UN Food System Summit, and it has been recognized as one of the main papers on indigenous peoples' food systems. We have carried out important consultations in North America, 2 of them, as well as in the Arctic, another 2. And we just concluded on Friday last week the Global Indigenous Youth Forum that gathered more than 150 indigenous youth from the 7 sociocultural regions. The Wipala paper is available both in the FAO page as well as in the scientific group page informing the UN Food System Summit. I would like to, in closing, I would like to talk about the launching of a book that we are doing this Friday, 25th of June. Of course, all of you are invited. It is about the indigenous people's food systems, insights on sustainability and resilience from the front lines of climate change. And this book will be talking about the research and the evidence we have found in 8 indigenous people's food systems across the world, from the Arctic to the Sahel, from the Amazon jungle to the India jungles, and as well as a small island food systems. You are all invited. You can find the register link. I will put it in the chat, and you can find it in the FAO webpage. Now, what can be done? And these are my closing messages. The first and most important is ensure the legal recognition of the collective rights of indigenous peoples, but very important to ensure that indigenous peoples are engaged in policy and decision-making processes at all levels. We need interculturality, not only in the schools, in school feeding, which is essential, but also in university and in policy making. And we are very far from having intercultural approaches that include indigenous peoples and recognize their knowledge. We do need to adopt policies and programs that are appropriate and that are based on free, prior, and informed consent. And it's extremely important that we enhance and preserve indigenous people's food systems to protect biodiversity. And for this, any of the processes of co-creation of knowledge are fundamental for all of us to work together, learn from each other, and ensure that the circularity we see in indigenous people's societies is also practiced in many of the ways that we are doing programs and scientific work. Thank you so much for your attention, and over to you, Martha.
Thank you very much, John, for joining us today and for giving a comprehensive overview of the amazing work that Indigenous Peoples Unit at FAO is doing. And definitely, I would like to invite everyone to join the upcoming book launch, sorry, which will be, I think, this Friday. And Jon, if you could share in the chat box the link so people could follow and register, would be amazing. Thank you once again. And we are running out of time a little bit, but we can have really just 5 minutes, maybe 6 for a discussion. I think we would take 1, maximum 2 questions. I will give the floor to Emma to facilitate this short open discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Martha, and thank you so much to our participants and our speakers today. This has been a really interesting discussion. So from the few things that I have picked up today, so really we're sort of the central discussions here are around you know, this disconnect between indigenous and traditional knowledge and sort of I guess Western or Anglo-Western forest education, and this is something that we've really picked up in the Global Forest Education Project. Obviously, this massive disconnect, and it's sort of how do we improve this disconnect? How can we do this respectfully? How can we do this consensually? How can we ensure that intellectual property rights are observed and respected, basically? So we had a few questions in the chat, but maybe I could sort of send one question first of all, perhaps to Margaret. And the question really, maybe to get the conversation going for a few minutes, is basically when you're talking about knowledge bearers, and obviously this is a thing that we see all across the world, especially where a lot of knowledge sort of is contained by sort of the elders of any sort of group or community. So how do we ensure that knowledge, and how do we ensure that language as well, in the case of indigenous peoples, how do we ensure that we can protect that knowledge? You know, and I think you touched upon digitization, and this was also mentioned in the chat. So how important is that to ensuring the protection of knowledge for forest management?
Thank you very much, Emma. You know, my colleague mentioned the fact that when you go out to the field, the local people are pretty suspicious of you when you want to tap a bit of knowledge from them. So it's always so difficult trying to get all the information together, but the minute they get your trust, they are able to open up and tell you a few things about the local knowledge that they have. And when we get their trust, we just document all that they say, but then we don't take what they say at face value. We have to go back and check whether they are speaking the truth or whether it's been documented somewhere. So we check from the literature to see whether anybody anywhere else around the world has made any reference to some of these species or whatever it is they are talking about. Then we need to go back to the lab, to our computers, and try to get the knowledge documented. So we create fields for the resource. So we have the species name, the scientific name, the local name, and all that. And then we take digital images of the plant species, so the fruits, the roots, what the tree, and all that. And then we put them into the database. And it is important to have these things documented and stored somehow. Because even in Ghana right now, what is happening is that there's this mad rush for gold. So even in forest reserves, people are going in to mine gold, and they are destroying the habitat of many of these valuable species. So if you don't document them, you don't find out the location where they are endemic, and you store them, very soon we are going to lose all that knowledge because nobody will know what it is all about. I hope I've understood.
Great, thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you. Do we have any sort of questions from the floor? If you'd like to maybe have a question for any of our panelists, please raise your hand and we can unmute you. So we maybe have a few more minutes left. Thank you so much again for that, Margaret. Perhaps something that that we've sort of come across in the project is as I say, this sort of the sort of this massive disconnect between formal education and sort of indigenous and traditional knowledge. And for me, it's this sort of, you know, it's this struggle of having to obviously make sure that this traditional indigenous knowledge is respected, and also it's not just sort of it's not just an add-on to formal sort of Western knowledge. I think that's really the most important thing, that this knowledge needs to be highlighted for the, you know, for the sort of sacredness of what it is. So it's, you know, how do we ensure that we're doing that within these sort of Western forest education and knowledge systems? And I think that's the real trouble that we've been seeing. So does anyone have any further comments on this, or does anyone have any additional questions? Marta, is there anything you'd like to add? Gordon, is there anything you'd like to add?
If there are no additional questions from anyone, I hope it doesn't mean that it was not interesting, but rather that there are so many questions and we have such a little time to discuss that really we need to connect and continue to work together. And in fact, our virtual room will close in 3 minutes, and we have no power to extend this session, unfortunately. So I guess I would like to thank once again all the speakers. And even though we have to close now, I hope really that we will continue to work together to make forest education more holistic and inclusive of diversity of knowledge systems. I'll try to summarize briefly what has been discussed today. We talked about, we continue to talk about and discussing the ways and examples of bridging traditional and scientific knowledge. We talked about the benefits of developing local curricula through participatory processes involving various knowledge holders. We mentioned several challenges and opportunities of indigenous knowledge documentation and digitization. We also talked about a number of practical, legal, and ethical challenges when it comes to intellectual property rights and traditional knowledge, and the need to consider those in forest education. And we also got an introduction to the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems, an initiative definitely worth joining. And the summary of the recommendations from this session will be communicated by Gordon, our rapporteur, at the plenary session later today, and I would like to invite you to attend. They will also be included in the conference proceedings. Both of our sessions were recorded, and they will be available at some point on the conference website. Thank you so much once again. And also, I would like to remind you that the global call to action has been launched yesterday. And you're welcome to, I endorse it myself, and you're also welcome to join that call. Yeah, I think that's all from me. Thank you so much.